And I wanted to start by welcoming everyone to our public hearings, our public meetings on Maricopa County's role in redistricting as well as reprecincting. And after every 10 years, nationally we do a census, or not the elections department, but the Census Bureau does a census. And after that decennial census, jurisdictions across the country go through redistricting efforts, and Arizona and Maricopa County is no different. And that's what we're here to talk about today, and primarily reprecincting and how some of the changes that the Elections Department and the Justice Court are going to recommend to the Board of Supervisors. And the Board of Supervisors will consider some of these changes related to voting precincts and Justice Court precincts. And today we'll be focusing on Board of Supervisor District 4, any of those changes that are in District 4. District 4 is in our west side of Maricopa County, which includes cities of Glendale, Goodyear, Avondale, Surprise, Sun City West. It even goes as far north as Wickenburg and Aguila. So that's the area that we'll be discussing today. This is our third public comment meeting. The first two comment meetings covered Board of Supervisor Districts 1 and Board of Supervisor District 2, and those are on the opposite side of the county in the East Valley. So, and these public meetings are very, very important to us because we want to get input from community members. So we go through and we do a lot of data crunching and analysis to try to identify where the best voting lines would be, where the best lines for justice courts would be. And as we do that analysis, and we use a very rigorous methodology to make our decisions, but sometimes we could miss something. And that's where you come in and your role in providing us input and how we can make adjustments. And then we can consider those as we propose these changes to the Board of Supervisors. And we've actually received many comments through our public website already. And we'll be going through our public website here shortly on how to use it. And we'll talk about some of the input today in one of the precincts and how we're going to make a potential change or how we can accommodate some of that public input. So it's very valuable for you to submit those comments and questions as we go through this process. So before we get started into the nuts and bolts, I do have some housekeeping items that I want to review with you all. And just want to let you all know that this meeting is being recorded, and next week we'll be posting all of these recordings from all of our public comment meetings on our website, and that's Reprecincting.Maricopa.Vote, the same site that you use to register for this meeting. All attendees have their videos off and they are muted. We do that so we can progress through the meeting, keep to our timeline. We have a lot of information to cover, but that does not discourage you from submitting comments. And you can submit a comment using the Zoom chat feature. And you can find that by hovering over. Usually it's at the bottom of your screen. And if you take your mouse, you hover over that bottom portion, and a little pop-up will come up. And then there's a feature that has a little bubble and it says chat underneath it. And if you select that, the chat box will show and you'll be able to see other users' comments, as well as you can type in and enter your comment. We'll be answering those as we go through the meeting. We'll answer some immediately by typing back to you. Others will answer some of the individuals that we have assisting us will actually ask us the questions, and then we'll make sure we'll answer those verbally. If you are attending via phone and not in the meeting itself, that doesn't mean that you can't submit a comment. It just means that we won't be able to answer it in real time during the meeting, but you can go to send us an email at voterinfo@risk.maricopa.gov. Again, that email is voterinfo@risk.maricopa.gov. And it's actually, and it's spelled VOTERINFO, the @ symbol, RISC.MARICOPA.gov. And if you send that email to us, we'll make sure that you get a response. And before we start for the next portion, I do want to, if we have any Spanish speaking attendees, I'm going to actually turn it over to Selena Olivis Iglesias, and she's our bilingual community outreach coordinator, and she's going to provide this opening remarks in Spanish. Thank you, Selena.
Gracias. Primero que nada, bienvenido. Y muchísimas gracias por asistir a las reuniones públicas de redistribución del Condado Maricopa. Después del censo que se realiza cada 10 años, las entidades responsables de evaluar los límites de los distritos deben comenzar a redistribuir sus esfuerzos a nivel federal, estatal y local. Hoy vamos a discutir el papel que desempeña el Condado Maricopa al rediseñar las líneas de distritos y recintos, y así revisar los detalles de los cambios que la Junta de Supervisores considerará para los recintos electorales y los recintos del Tribunal de Justicia. A medida que la Junta evalúa estos cambios propuestos, el condado ha establecido una serie de reuniones públicas y un sitio web público para solicitar sus aportaciones y sus observaciones. Todas estas observaciones recibidas en este foro se van a tomar en cuenta para la redistribución de distritos y recintos. El enfoque de la reunión pública de hoy detallará principalmente los cambios propuestos en el recinto electoral y Tribunal de Justicia que se están considerando dentro de los límites del distrito número 4 de la Junta de Supervisores. Pero antes de comenzar, me gustaría dar unos anuncios de logística de la reunión. Primero que nada, les quiero informar que esta reunión está siendo grabada y será publicada en línea la próxima semana en el sitio web, el mismo en el que ustedes se registraron para atender a esta reunión. La página web es Reprecincting.Maricopa.Vote. También, si usted tiene algún comentario o alguna pregunta, por favor, use la función del chat de Zoom para escribir su comentario o pregunta. Estas serán respondidas a lo largo de esta presentación. También pueden enviar sus comentarios o preguntas en línea en el mismo sitio web Redistribución.Maricopa.Vote o bien enviando un correo electrónico a la página voterinfo@risc.maricopa.gov. En el chat también está escrito esta página para que lo tengan más fácilmente. Muchísimas gracias.
Sorry, I was still muted. So a brief overview of our agenda today. We'll do a brief welcome for our participants from the Justice Courts. We have 2 judges that will be going through the methodology that the Justice Courts use through the reprecincting efforts. We'll then talk about Maricopa County's role in redistricting. We'll go into some detail about what is reprecincting. We'll turn it over and go through our website. We'll talk about what information that we have on our website, how members from the public can submit public comments and other types of items related to the website. Then we'll go into the details of the Justice Court methodology. We'll go through and talk about how we made and are recommending changes for the voting precinct methodology. And then we have several different exhibits that go into detail about those specific changes that we're recommending for Board of Supervisor District 4 for voting precincts, which will include some of the changes for the Justice Court precincts as well. And then we'll do an overview of any questions or answers if we have time at the end of the presentation. So before we start, I want to introduce a couple judges. We have presiding judge Anna Huberman. She is the Justice Peace in Country Meadows Precinct, where she has served since 2012. When the Board of Supervisors created the Country Meadows Justice Court. The Justices of the Peace in Maricopa County elected Judge Huberman to serve as the presiding Justice of the Peace, and her term leadership position began on July 1st. Prior to her election to the bench, Judge Huberman served as court interpreter with the Maricopa County Superior Court for 15 years. So Judge Huberman, do you have any opening remarks for us?
Thank you, Scott. Good evening, and thank you all for participating. I just want to say that the process of looking into changes to our Justice Court precincts began early this year. With the help of our stellar staff and court administration, who helped evaluate the caseloads at each court and map the JPCs by voting precincts, we were able to propose solutions to even out the workload between neighboring courts as much as possible. A special thanks goes out to Recorder Richard's staff, who assisted us on every step of the way. A lot of time and effort was put into this project by our then presiding judge, Keith Russell, and court administrator, Jim Morrow. They worked closely with the presiding constable, Mike Branham, and our operations team. They came up with a plan, made regional presentations of their suggestions, had individual conversations with the judges and constables, and ran and reran the numbers as other suggestions were proposed. By the time I was elected presider, most of the decisions and agreements were already in place. Myself and our new court administrator, Chris Reams, are extremely grateful for their dedication and hard work on this project. I would also like to acknowledge Judge Craig Wismer, who from the Arrowhead Justice Court, who is here this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Judge Freeman. And the next judge I'd like to read a little short bio on is Judge Keith Russell. He is a Justice of the Peace in the East Mesa Precinct. He has served since 2013. The Justice of the Peace in Maricopa County elected Judge Russell to serve as the presiding judge, our presiding Justice of the Peace in 2017 and again in 2019. He completed his term in that leadership position in June. Prior to taking the bench, Judge Russell served as the Maricopa County Assessor, having first been elected in 2004 and then re-elected in 2008 and 2012. So Judge Russell, do you have any opening remarks for us?
Thank you, Scott. And let me thank everybody who is participating in today's meeting. There's been a lot of work that has gone into this process. There's a lot of people that I ought to be naming individually, but the list is too long. I do think I would like to say a special thank you, if I can, to Chairman Sellers of the Board of Supervisors for his support in this activity, Recorder Richard and all of his staff. And then I need to say thank you to the staff in the justice courts, the administrators, the folks who have been crunching the numbers, who've been working with the individual JPs and constables, and am just very, very grateful for the approach that all of them took in coming up with a plan that could be supported by the entire group. Thank you, everyone, for that effort. And as we go through the presentation, you'll be able to see the net result of that effort. So thank you for the opportunity to be here, Scott.
Thank you, Judge Russell. So now we're going to turn it over to Kara Coleman. She is a member of the Maricopa County Recorder's Office, and she's tasked with working on many special projects for the Elections Department and the Recorder's Office. And she's going to go over our Reprecincting website and the different information that we've made available on how it functions. So Kara, are you ready?
I'm ready. Thank you, Scott. All right. Well, welcome everyone. I am going to do a brief review of the website displayed on the screen you'll see here. This website can be found at Reprecincting.Maricopa.Vote, and it is going to provide the public with all of the information the Board of Supervisors will be considering on proposed changes to voting and justice court precincts. On these pages, which we'll go through individually in a moment, voters can find the historic maps dating back to 2006, detailing changes made over the last 15 years to both voting and justice court precincts, as you can see here. Do give it a moment to pull them up. They're pulling a lot of data. In addition, voters can also load and view the proposed map changes that we'll be discussing in more detail this evening for District 4. The website also provides information about the methodology used to make these proposed changes and provides the public a place to make those comments and provide feedback for the board and the justice courts to consider as they are making decisions on these changes. On the first tab, you will find information available for voting precincts. And the second tab provides the same information for the Justice Court precincts, tailored to their changes and lines drawn in those areas. Each tab provides an avenue for feedback for general comments, as well as comments specific to voting or Justice Court precincts, respectively. The third tab, where you registered to attend this meeting, is where we will post the recordings of these meetings and the slide presentations for the public to review. Finally, I'll note that all of this content can be found in both English and Spanish to ensure this is accessible to all constituents in Maricopa County to be able to provide feedback and comments the board is looking forward to considering. An individual can click on the toggle right here at the top or go directly to the Spanish language URL of Redistribución.Maricopa.Vote to access this information. We will provide these links again in the chat for easy reference. Thank you again for joining us tonight, and I will turn it back to you, Scott.
Thank you, Kara. So let me return back to the presentation. So I believe my screen is now sharing the PowerPoint presentation. And the next piece that we'll go into is to discuss Maricopa County's role within the broader redistricting efforts that are occurring in Arizona as well as in Maricopa County. And many of you are probably familiar with our U.S. House of Representatives. You may not know that how those boundaries are determined, the congressional district boundaries, are through an independent redistricting commission. And this is actually established in the Arizona State Constitution, Article 4, Part 2, Section 1. And the Independent Redistricting Commission is tasked with drawing these lines using census data, population data, to determine how those boundaries will be drawn. In Maricopa County, because we are the largest as far as population county within Arizona, actually 8 of those congressional district boundaries overlap Maricopa County's boundaries. The Independent Redistricting Commission is also tasked with redrawing the legislative district boundaries. And there are 30 within Arizona, and those those boundaries then are where our state senators and our state representatives and how they are elected. And Maricopa County currently has 20 legislative district boundaries that overlap our county as well. Usually the Independent Redistricting Commission gets started on their analysis earlier in those years that have an odd number. So in 2021, that'd be in January, February, March. But due to the pandemic, the Census Bureau released their data much later in the year. They actually didn't release the data that the IRC needed and other districts needed until towards the end of August. So right now their plan is to get the county the information we need to incorporate their new boundaries into our GIS systems in either late 2021, most likely towards the end of December, or in early 2022. And then because Maricopa County has so many of those congressional districts and legislative district lines that cross our borders, we'll then have to take that information and import it into our mapping systems to make sure that they are aligning with the current boundaries and other district boundaries. The other boundaries that you may be are interested in is the Board of Supervisor boundaries. So typically, the board is required to update those boundaries by December 1st of any year after a decennial census. However, the legislature recognized that due to the delayed census data being released, that the Board of Supervisors for all counties would need more time to implement those boundaries and then also work with the other districts that are going through redistricting. So they gave an extension, and now the board is required to review those lines and consider different lines by July 1st, 2022. That was actually in Senate Bill 1107. And then any changes made to those lines would not go into effect until January 2024, right before the next presidential election. So there's 2 other entities within the Maricopa County that follow the Board of Supervisors lines, and that is the Community College District, as well as the Special Healthcare District. And then there's many other districts within the county boundaries that are also going through redistricting efforts. There are 6 cities and towns that are going through that effort right now. They include the city of Phoenix, Peoria, Glendale, Mesa, Surprise, and Buckeye. And then we have 3 schools We have the Phoenix Union Schools School District. We have the East Valley Institute of Technology, and we have the West Meck districts that are also considering redrawing their boundaries as well. And those entities would be providing their information also in late 2021 or early 2022. And then our GIS team will be tasked with going through, taking all of that information, making sure that there's no inconsistencies between those boundaries, and then implementing that into our system. And that's where we'll get our final voting precincts for the 2022 cycle. So with that, I'm going to actually turn it over to Judge Huberman to talk through Justice Court precincts and the methodologies that the Justice Courts use to identify potential changes that they'll be recommending to the board.
All right, thank you, Scott. I want to start off by saying that in Maricopa County, we do have 26 justice courts. 25 of those are full-time courts, and our Ironwood Justice Court is a part-time court. Our judges and administration have been aware for some time now of issues with our current precinct lines that have created an imbalance in the workload among our courts. As you will hear in the recorder's portion this evening, the basis in determining voting precincts lines is population. But for the Justice Court precincts, it's JPCs. So we should start by explaining what judicial productivity credits are. Justice courts hear 7 types of cases. Those different case types generate different amounts of work, both for the judge and for the staff, depending on many, many different factors. And the case types vary from court to court based on geography and boundaries. Some courts may have more seasonal work because they have lakes or rivers. Some courts have more freeways, which create more criminal traffic cases. Some courts have more apartment complexes, which translates into more evictions. Although there could be different metrics to measure work in the Justice Court, the legislature has settled on JPCs. JPCs assign a value to each case type filed in court. Excuse me. Those values are legislated in statute, ARS 22-125. ARS 22-125 also provides that judicial salaries are determined by the total judicial productivity credits. But what interests us today is subsection H, which establishes that a Justice Court precinct shall not exceed 1,200 JPCs. If it does, the County Board of Supervisors shall create sufficient courts, meaning they could add a new court, or redraw the Justice Court precinct boundaries. Our proposal today is to redraw the lines. Next slide, please. As you will see, the workload across the different courts in the county is very imbalanced. We have 2 courts that currently exceed 1,200 JPCs as described in the statute. Although constables are elected in the same precincts as the Justice of the Peace, the constable workload is not driven by JPCs and may be difficult to measure. Constable work is higher in precincts with high evictions, such as Country Meadows and Manistee. Among other things, constables serve orders of protection on defendants that reside in the constable's precinct, regardless of which judge issued the order. Next slide. Taking into account the total workload in the county, a perfect balance would be 900 JPCs per court. In this graph, the green section shows the courts that are currently between 800 and 1,000 JPCs. As you can see, we currently have 9 courts in the low range of JPCs, 2 of those under 700. 7 courts are in the high range, 2 of those over 1,200. So I will now turn it over to Judge Keith Russell.
Thank you, Judge Huberman. So the screen now, or the map on the screen now, shows most of Maricopa County. It denotes the 26 different justice courts as well as the 5 Board of Supervisor district areas. Once again, we're focusing today on District 4 up in the northwest part of the valley. As you can see on the map, some of our court boundaries cover large geographical areas and some cover smaller geographical areas. The reason is those JPCs that Judge Huberman was just talking about, and those workloads that are measured by the JPCs. The proposed changes on this map are going to be denoted by the brighter colored areas and also the lines that are dotted around those brighter colored areas. So in District 4, we have all or part of 7 different justice courts. The Ironwood Court, the White Tank Court, Country Meadows Court, the Manistee Court, North Valley Court, Arrowhead Court, and the Hacienda Court. The Ironwood Court is located down in the lower left or southwest corner of the map that's on the screen right now. This is the one that Judge Huberman denoted as a part-time court, and it goes all the way down to Gila Bend and includes a large geographical area with relatively low population. The White Tank Court is adjoining Ironwood at its northeast corner for Ironwood, or the southwest corner for White Tanks. We're proposing moving a section of the White Tanks Court, and this is going to be that brighter blue area with the dotted line, into the Gila Bend, or into the Ironwood Court. White Tanks workload, or JPCs, is at the upper end of the range, and this will help prepare them for future development. The net shift of JPCs from White Tanks to Ironwood is approximately 100. Now, the Country Meadows Justice Court is our busiest court based upon JPCs. It's located in more of the central part of the map. It is the whiter colored shaded area. We are proposing 3 changes to Country Meadows. 1 is inside District 4 and 2 are actually outside of District 4, but we want to talk about them today. So at the northwest boundary of the Country Meadows Court, this area that's proposed to go to the Arrowhead Court is inside District 4. It's the darker purple area you see on the map. The other proposed changes are located in the southwest area of Country Meadows. They are the darker green area going to the Agua Fria Court and the darker blue area going to the Maryville Court. And again, both of these changes are located in Supervisory District number 5. The proposed changes will reduce Country Meadows JPCs by approximately 380 JPCs. To the north and east, or upper right from Country Meadows, is the Manistee Court, and that's being shown as the pink area. Manistee is our second busiest justice court based upon JPCs. It has a proposed change in its northwest corner, also to the Arrowhead Court. This is that darker blue area. It has also a change in its southeast area going to the West McDowell Court. This is the darker light blue. And the last change in Manistee is at its northeast corner, and this is going to the North Valley Court. This is a darker orange area. All of these moves are reflected on the maps by the dotted line, and again, the brighter colors for the 3 courts that are receiving. And the net effect to Manistee from these 3 changes is a reduction of JPCs of approximately 240. As Judge Huberman talked about, JPCs don't match case filings. It takes a number of groups of cases to equal one JPC, depending upon the case type. Charlie Barrett, who is in the Justice Court's administration, did the number crunching for a lot of this project, and I need to express my appreciation to Charlie. He gave me an estimate today that changes in Country Meadow and Manistee, if you translate those into cases, will account to approximately 7,000 cases per year, which gives you a sense of the workload change. But again, these are our two busiest courts, and I need to express my appreciation to Judge Huberman, who is the judge for Country Meadows, and Judge Watts, who's the judge for the Manistee, for carrying heavier caseloads than most of our courts for a number of years. Our last change we talk about is in the North Valley. This is partly located in District 4, but the changes are actually located outside for the most part, or the bigger geographical changes are located outside of District 4. Those are shown by the dotted lines, the brighter orange area right at the top of the map, and the darker pink area just to the below and to the right. These areas are changes that are proposed being made with the Desert Ridge Court, which is directly to the east of North Valley, as well as the other change that we talked about with Manistee in the North Valley's southern region. North Valley and Manistee, or the net result for North Valley, is approximately 40 JPCs being added. And for Desert Ridge, it's between 10 and 15 JPCs being added with this change to them. If we can go to our next map. Thank you. This zooms in on just District 4. It gives you more detail, but it doesn't allow us to talk about all the changes quite as easy as the other one did. But this shows our courts, and the white lines on this map denote the voting precincts that are going to be talked about more in a little bit, and how those make up each individual justice court precinct. If we could go to the next one, please. So we gave you the answer. Now let's talk about how we got to the proposed answer. And again, we do look for forwards to input and recognize that there are potential opportunities for some changes with what's being proposed. But the solution is also articulated for the imbalance in our courts and the statutes. And in ARS 22101A, it talks about the justice courts can be changed or abolished by the Board of Supervisors. And it tasks the board with that responsibility, as Judge Huberman has already talked about a little bit. Let's go to the next slide, please. The pandemic has been challenging in many areas. It has changed our caseloads for the last couple of years. So as we were creating a model to try to measure proposed changes, we had to go back in time and look at statistical data from calendar year 2019. Those changes were very prominent with evictions, for example, being lower during the pandemic, but also traffic citations being lower. But we do expect those to come up. We expect that 2019 data to be a good measurement of what the future holds, with an understanding Maricopa County has continued to grow over that time. Let's go to the next slide, please. So the goal was to balance the top 5 high and low courts, to balance out the extremes that you saw on the bar chart that Judge Huberman showed you a little bit earlier. And then when opportunities arose, to make some additional adjustments to allow easier access to the courts for some citizens of the county, and recognizing other geographical features. Let's go to the next one. And I think this is Judge Huberman again.
Thank you, Judge Russell. So to achieve these goals, we had to consider certain parameters. We had to draw our lines along the voting precinct lines. Voting precincts cannot be split into more than one justice court precinct. The second part of today's presentation, as we've said, deals with those changes to the voting precinct lines. So in the end, some of our justice court lines may change in accordance to some of the changes being proposed by the elections office. Most of our courts reside in co-located facilities. So the court building itself cannot be in each individual court's precinct, but it should be in the precinct of one of the courts from that building, preferably centrally located. For the standalone courts, the ones that don't share a building, it was important to make sure that the location of the courthouse remained in the precinct, as well as the home of both elected officials, so they don't get drawn out of their precincts. The next slide, please. Once we identified the courts with the highest and lowest JPCs, we looked at the adjoining precincts to see where adjustments could be made. The objective was to find an equitable solution for all the courts and elected officials involved to try to get all courts to between 800 and 1,000 JPCs. Once again, I must commend Judge Russell and Constable Branham in working with all the elected officials to come up with a solution that everyone could agree with. I would also like to thank the judges and constables who agreed to add precincts, adding to their caseload to allow the highest JPC courts relief. Next slide. Our statistician was able to break down the JPC data to the voting precinct level. This allowed us to look for the most obvious boundary adjustments between higher and lower JPC in adjoining precincts. We tried to minimize complex adjustment involving more than two courts. And if the more obvious or simple adjustment was not viable, we did try to employ common sense in our moves. We were very fortunate to be able to keep the boundary line adjustments to adjoining precincts in all but one situation. For example, even though our two highest JPC courts, Country Meadows and Manistee, share a boundary, we were able to adjust their boundary lines along with other adjoining courts whose JPCs were at the lower end of the spectrum. The one more complicated move was adjusting McDowell Mountain upward. We did not have an obvious choice to move from an adjoining precinct. We needed to move some area from the downtown Justice Court to the Arcadia Biltmore Justice Court, so Arcadia Biltmore could then move another area to the McDowell Mountain Court. We need to express our appreciation to the three courts involved with this move. As you can imagine, a three-way move is considerably more complicated than a two-way move. The downtown Justice Court precinct is located just where it sounds, in downtown Phoenix. The Arcadia Biltmore precinct is located to the north and east of downtown, and McDowell Mountain precinct in the East Phoenix and runs northeast to the McDowell Mountain area. In a manner of speaking, this three-way move allowed JPCs from downtown to be moved into McDowell Mountain. Next slide. Here you can see what the expected balance will look like. As you can see, except for a few exceptions, all courts will fall between the 800 and 1,000 JPC, which was our goal. Ironwood, again, is our part-time court, which is why their JPCs are so much lower. After this plan was finalized and agreed to, we realized that some of the changes proposed by the Elections Department to voting precincts would affect some of our numbers. Most of the changes are minimal and shouldn't have a huge impact on any court, but the final numbers might be a little bit different than what you see on this chart. And with that, if there are no further questions, I will turn it back to Scott Jarrett from the Election Department.
Thank you, Judge Huberman. Kara, do we have any questions for the justice courts or the judges?
Scott, we do not.
Okay, thank you. So the next portion of the presentation will be discussing some of our key goals and priorities for updating voting precincts. And some of you may be wondering, why we use voting precincts and why they're important. And they're actually established in statute, but from the elections department, they're critically important to how we operate and prepare for elections. They're basically the foundation and the building blocks for everything that we do and many of the decisions we make. Everything from our warehouse and logistics teams on how we deploy resources and identify our routes that we'll distribute and have our truck drivers follow. We use them to identify how we're going to send our sample ballots and who is going to receive those sample ballots. We use them to help determine what's going to be on a voter's ballot. So the voting precinct itself doesn't determine that, it's the surrounding districts, but that's how we identify what should be on each individual voter's ballot. In the August primary election for 2020, Maricopa County had over 15,000 different ballot styles. For the November 2020 general election, we had over 10,000 ballot styles when you include our bilingual Spanish ballot. So that can be very complex, and the precincts are what help guide us to make sure that we have everything correct on those ballots. And then the parties themselves and members of the public, they use the precinct data. So as we progress through an election, we release data to the parties that who's requested a early ballot, who's returned that early ballot. And that's at the precinct level. So the legislative district chairs, the precinct committeemen, they can then use that information for get out the vote efforts. And then finally, we use this for reporting results. So this is the smallest district that we report results. It ends up in Maricopa County because we're so large. Our canvas, our full canvas being over 10,000 pages long. And because we have over 70 contests on a ballot for the November 2020 general election. So by precinct, every single contest that was voted in that precinct, we report those results. And then again, the parties and members of the media and the public will analyze and review those results as well at that precinct level. So when we set about redrawing and updating our voting precincts and making recommendations for the board, we followed really 4 goals. One was to provide for a smooth voting experience. And the other was to make accommodations or adjustments because of the massive amounts of growth that have occurred in Maricopa County. So in Arizona, we're one of the fastest growing states. We had over 760,000 new residents moved to Arizona. And Maricopa County had 80% of those new residents in the last 2020 census. It was just over 603,000 new individuals move, or at least our population increased by that much from 2010 to 2020. So we need to make accommodations to adjust for that growth. Also, we last updated our lines in 2018, our voting precinct lines. Prior to that is 2012. But when we drew those lines in 2018, there were some homes that didn't exist. And since then, there's been some new construction. And because of that, that's created situations where some of our voting precincts are cutting through a home, an apartment complex, or another building. And we wanted to address those situations as well. Then lastly was, as the justice courts were going through their efforts to determine any changes that they needed to make, we wanted to make sure that our voting precincts aligned with the justice court precincts as well. So by the numbers, so I did just mention that we last updated our voting precincts in 2018. Countywide, we're considering 133 total changes. That includes 73 changes that are due to population growth. And we identify precincts that have over 5,000 voters. That's usually the happy medium that we find that allows for us to be able to really have a smooth voting, in-person voting operation, is when we have these precincts segregated and divided up into 5,000 voters. We also look at voters that are on the active early voting list. It used to be called the permanent early voting list, but now it's the active early voting list. We try to keep that less than 2,000 total voters. We identified 16 instances where a precinct was cutting through a home or a building. There's 32 here on the slide. That's because that results in 32 different changes. You have to move 2 different precincts when that occurs. So the 16 homes results in 32 precinct changes. And then there's 40 instances where we made adjustments to align the voting precincts with the justice courts. But if you total the 73, 32, and 40, that actually comes out to 145 total changes. And the reason why that's more is 12 of them those changes were made for multiple reasons. So they're included and counted in those figures above more than once. So what we'll be recommending to the board is moving from 748 precincts, which we currently have right now, to 834. So that'd be adding 86 total precincts to or within Maricopa County. So these will be approved or considered for approval by the Board of Supervisors on September 27th at a special board meeting. And then they would go into effect if they are approved on January 2nd, 2022. So now before we get into going through each individual change or the exhibit, did want to show this county-wide map. And this is showing the different changes that we're making for voting precincts. So if it's a light blue color, we're not recommending any changes. If it's a green color, we are recommending changes. And as you can see, the vast majority of the changes are in the far southeast valley and the far west valley. And that is a result of where the population growth is occurring in Maricopa County. Those changes that are in our central corridor or central Phoenix, those are mostly due to changes to align voting precincts with the Justice Court precincts. So with that, I'm going to invite Gary Bellata. He's our director for GIS, or Geographical Information Systems, to join me. And we're going to go through the exhibits for all the voting precinct changes that will occur in District 4. So let me pull up those exhibits. Gary, can you see those?
I can, Scott. They look great.
Okay, great. So just a little overview of what this exhibit, the information that we're displaying here. So there's two images. There's an image on the left that it shows the current precincts that will be going. In this case, it's for Alsop precinct. And then there's an image on the right, which shows the proposed changes that we're recommending to the board. The red color are showing the current precincts as they are. The lighter yellow or tan color will show how the precincts will be structured in the future version. And then those sort of pink lines that border the boundaries of the precinct is what you can use to identify what those new boundaries would be. And in the case of Alsop, the reason we're adjusting this precinct is due to some voter growth issues, and also to make accommodations for an adjacent precinct. So Alsop precinct here is actually where Luke Air Force Base is, out there in the far west valley. So it's bordered by, at the south end, Camelback Mountain, our Camelback Road, at the top end there, Northern Road. It's close to the 303 and then Litchfield Road as well. And right now, currently there's 1,190 voters in Alsop precinct. So that's not a lot of voters because most of it is Luke Air Force Base. But this is really to make room for the precinct that's right next to Alsop. So, and that's the Waddell precinct, I believe, right, Gary?
Yes,
And we'll
Mr.
get to
Waddell
that.
now.
We'll get to that precinct as we in an exhibit here shortly. Are there any other points that you want to make related to Alsop, Gary?
That's the only point. This is really just to help the Waddell precinct to the west and alleviate the voter totals there.
So, and we have for District 4, we have 31 different exhibits that we'll be going through. And I do have some stats specific to District 4. So 31 total changes. 4 of those are related to a precinct cutting through a home. The vast majority are related to population growth or increases in the number of registered voters. That'll be 27. And then there's 3 changes specifically related to aligning precincts with justice courts. So we'll go through and get to our next exhibit. So the next exhibit is for Butler precinct, and this is also to accommodate voter growth. Butler precinct is in Glendale, and its closest cross streets are 59th Avenue and Olive. There are currently 7,183 total voters within Butler, and we're actually recommending a new precinct here. This would be Desert Rose Precinct. So if you see the image on the left, we've actually split Butler sort of down the middle, and it's along 55th Avenue. And so Butler then would be on the west side of the precinct, and the new precinct would be Desert Rose on the east side. And what that would do to voter registration numbers within that precinct. So Butler, I mentioned 7,183, it would drop to 4,504. And then Desert Rose would have 2,671 total voters within those precincts. Anything else here you want to mention, Gary?
I did want to mention, the description was perfect. I did want to mention here, we cut it on 55th Avenue, which gives a little bit of an imbalance between the two voting precincts in terms of total voters. The Butler one had 4,000 or so at the end, and then the Desert Rose one had only a little bit over 2,000. But we really try to have the boundaries of the voting precincts along major roads rather than cutting through neighborhoods. We could get this thing really close to even if we started cutting through neighborhoods, but that causes voter confusion. And so that's why we cut it at the 55th Avenue, is a more major of a road.
That's a good point, Gary. So as the GIS team does their analysis, they try to identify some of the most obvious or common sense boundaries that they could use to draw a boundary. So that might be a canal. They want to avoid that. If there's a mountain there, they'd probably split that between two different precincts if there was a mountain, or find a very major thoroughfare or a major road to draw their boundaries. So sometimes that does result in the balance of the number of voters being slightly off or askew between those precincts. But thank you, Gary. So the next exhibit is for the Cotton Lane voting precinct. And Cotton Lane is in Goodyear, and it's actually just outside the Loop 303 and close to Indian School. And you can see there, and this is again a precinct that's experienced a large amount of growth as far as population and the number of registered voters. And it was being split by I-10 along that 303 loop. And now what we're recommending is the Cotton Lane precinct. We will be adding a new precinct, the Lilac precinct, which would be south of I-10, and then the Cotton Lane would be north of I-10 there. And currently Cotton Lane had 5,889 voters. What this change would do is bring Cotton Lane down to 2,073 voters. So about 3,800 fewer voters. Then Lilac would then be at 3,832 total voters. So any other information there, Gary?
On this one for the Cotton Lane portion up on the north, at the end, it was about 2,000 voters, and that also leaves room for growth. That area is still growing. And so, eventually that'll make it up to 5,000 voters. And, years down the road, we may end up cutting that again into another voting precinct. But a lot of times we like to leave room for growth where it's, we can see that it's planned for the future, new subdivisions, at least in the relatively soon in the future.
Okay, thank you, Gary. So the next voting precinct we'll be covering is the Desert Oasis precinct, and this is also due to voter growth. This precinct is located in West Surprise near Sun Valley Parkway and 219th Avenue, so in the far west, Northwest Valley. And this is where we're expecting significant amount of growth, and it does currently have a high number of voters and a large amount of population increase. So Desert Oasis actually had over 10,000 voters in the prior boundaries, and we're actually recommending it be split into creating 5 new voting precincts out of Desert Oasis. So a significant number of new voting precincts here. What that would do is then allow Desert Oasis to go from 10,100 total voters to 2,526. And Desert Oasis then would be on the west side of US 60. And there's actually a lot of room for growth within Desert Oasis still, even though we've split it up and created additional precincts. But those additional precincts would be Tillman, Molly, Crabapple, Dale, and did I say Asante? Asante is the other one. So Asante, Tillman, Molly, Dale, and Crabapple would be the new precincts. And those would their total voters would be 2,688 for Tillman, Asante 860, Crabapple 2,747, Dale 1,961, and then Molly 1,733. And there's actually quite a bit of changes here going on. Gary, do you have any other insights or things that you want to point out?
I'll mention the Crabapple voting precinct. It was part of Desert Oasis, but it was also part of the Vistancia voting precinct and the Dusty Trail voting precinct. So if you had listed off the numbers of the new voting precincts, how many voter totals, and it would have numbered over 10,000 voters of the original Desert Oasis because of that Crabapple picking up voters from the Vistancia and the Desert Trail voting precinct.
And we'll
And then
actually go through some of those here in future exhibits.
Yeah. And then the Dale one up on the north took a little bit out of the Mountain Vista voting precinct as well. And that was to align to school district boundary in that area as well, just to try to reduce the number of voting precinct splits between other districts.
Thank you, Gary. So and speaking of Dusty Trail, so that's the next exhibit we'll be reviewing. And Dusty Trail is actually just a little bit east to the Desert Oasis, and then the Tillman, Asante, Crabapple, Dale, and Molly precincts that we're covering. This goes along Loop 303 here, and the Dusty Trail precinct currently had 9,053 total voters. These changes with the Crabapple and then Palm Ridge, which we did not discuss in the prior exhibit, will help Dusty Trail fall to 3,520 total voters. Crabapple, as we mentioned in the prior exhibit, was 2,747, and Palm Ridge is 3,881. So we have Crabapple right here, and then Palm Ridge towards the southern portion, the west portion of Dusty Trail. So, and that really follows actually below 303. So we've taken Dusty Trail to be not be above Loop 303, which it was in the prior boundaries. It's now going to be below Loop 303, and then to the east side of the Loop 303. So any other questions or insights there, Gary, on this exhibit?
I'll mention the Vistancia one is just to the north, and we took, actually that was Desert Oasis, I apologize for that. So yeah, so some of these boundaries here where you see where the Vistancia boundary and the new Crabapple boundary are, we left some of those boundaries where they were because it appears, at least on aerial photography, that, and if we look at the parcel layers, that if we leave those boundaries there, they'll hopefully in the future not cut through new homes and new subdivisions, because that appears where the parcels boundaries are currently at. And so, in the future, there may be more growth there. Somebody can come in and put a subdivision, and we may be splitting homes in the future, but at least for now, we left those there thinking that new subdivisions would follow those boundaries. And so that's what we're hoping for.
How typical is it for the new subdivisions to follow the same parcels that were previously drawn?
A lot of times that happens, but there's a handful of situations where that doesn't happen. When we took a look at District 1 the other day out in the Eastmark area, they completely bought up a whole lot of parcels and completely revamped the whole area. And so we ended up cutting, putting down voting precinct lines that we had to adjust because of the growth, and the voting precinct lines were cutting through homes, after the new subdivision was put in.
So well, it's good to know that we still have some data that we can use to try to project what the future parcels would be drawn, but it doesn't always turn out that way. All right, we'll go to the next voting precinct, and this is Festival Voting Precinct. This is North Buckeye along the Sun City Festival and Copper Canyon Golf Club, so in the far west portions of Maricopa County, and it's currently, and this is also being adjusted for population growth and the total number of voters. It currently has 6,194 total voters. We're recommending that we split this and create 3 new precincts as well. That'd be Sun Valley Precinct, Yukon Precinct, and Firehawk. What that would do is take Festival from 6,194 total voters to 1,939. And you can see there's still a lot of room for growth to occur in the Festival precinct. And then the Sun Valley precinct would be as 428 voters. It's here on the southern portion of the precinct, and there's just a few homes there over there in the east portion of that. The Yukon precinct, which is just north of that, has 2,057 total voters. And then the Firehawk precinct, which is the north portion here, would have 1,816, again, accommodating or allowing for a lot of future growth within these precincts. Anything else here, Gary?
Did want to mention, you already mentioned about the future growth. A lot of those streets that are on there are actually, the homes are not built on them yet. So like the Yukon one, there was only like 2,000 voters, but that's not completely built out with homes yet. The streets are laid down, but the homes are not all built there. So that's getting prepared for all those homes to be built. Really, this whole area is just being prepared for all those homes to be built over the next couple of years.
So the next precinct that we'll be covering is the grand voting precinct, and this is due to the precinct cutting through a few homes here, and it's actually identified by this line right here between Grand and then the precinct below it, Surprise Farms precinct. And do you recall, Gary, how many homes that were affected here?
There was about 20 to 25 homes here. There was no voters affected by moving the line. The line was really just at the kind of the backside of about 20 to 25 homes. We just wanted to be certain that it was very clear that that line was not to be cutting through those homes.
So are we just moving it north by,
Maybe 25 feet or so, 30 feet.
Okay, so we'll move on to the Hopeville precinct. And this is in Buckeye along Baseline and 85th State Route 85. And it's currently being adjusted because also lots of growth, population growth, and the number of registered voters. It's currently at 4,918, which is actually below our projected number of 5,000 voters. But again, this is to accommodate future growth. And our change would be to create the Twilight precinct, a new precinct here on the east side, just along Southern Avenue and Baseline. And then that would take Hopeville from 4,918 to 1,918. And then Twilight would be just over 3,000 total voters. But again, the ability to accommodate quite a bit of future growth. Any other changes here, Gary?
Those are all the changes, and there's definitely a lot of growth out there. So to accommodate that is what we're trying to do.
So the next exhibit covers Kenley Farms precinct, and Kenley Farms is in Surprise at Litchfield Road and Waddell. And this is also to accommodate lots of growth in this area. Kenley Farms currently has 7,362 total voters within this precinct. And what we're recommending is that we create two new precincts or add two new precincts, Mercer and Yucatan. So Kenley Farms would then take the north and east portion of the current precinct. Mercer and Yucatan would take the south portion. Mercer would be on the west. Yucatan would be on the east. And it would take Kenley Farms from 7,362 to 2,490 total voters. Mercer would have just over 3,000 total voters. And Yucatan would have 1,869. And there is still quite a bit of room for growth in that Yucatan precinct, and as well towards the east side of the Kenley Farms. Anything else here, Gary?
You're right, Scott, about that, all the growth on the east side there of Kenley Farms and Yucatan. So we're ready for that growth with those numbers, how we made them small enough to be able to absorb that growth in the future.
So the next precinct is the Lake Pleasant precinct, and this is, as the name suggests, very close to Lake Pleasant. It's just south of Lake Pleasant, and this is also to accommodate voter growth and population growth. Currently, it has 6,909 total voters in there. We're recommending creating a new precinct, which is the Cottontail precinct, which is here towards the south and east portion of the current precinct of Lake Pleasant. And that would then take Lake Pleasant to be 2,662 total voters. And then Cottontail would be 4,257 total voters. Anything else here, Gary?
Did want to mention on the north end of Lake Pleasant, where it's kind of a jagged edge. We straightened that out to go along a school district boundary line. There really aren't any voters up there yet, but eventually there will most likely to be voters. So we wanted to make sure that we were following the school district line to reduce splits in the future for that voting precinct.
Gary mentioned splits, and usually if we do have to split a precinct because of another boundary, that requires us to have another ballot style. As I mentioned, we had 15,000 ballot styles in the August 2020 primary. So we really prefer to limit those as much as possible. So the next exhibit that we'll be covering is the Liberty voting precinct. And this is in Buckeye along Broadway and Jackrabbit. And this was also to accommodate increases in population and voter registration numbers, as well as to accommodate some adjustments to adjacent precinct. And what we're recommending is creating an actually new precinct here, which would be the Getty precinct, which is on the east side of Liberty. Liberty is currently at 3,122 total voters. It is under the 5,000. There's lots of growth going on in this area. And then that would then take them to be 1,488. Getty would be 2,123. I imagine that this is also to accommodate some adjacent precincts. Do you want to give us some of the details of that, Gary?
Yeah, so up on the north side of Liberty, we took it up to a canal boundary through Orangewood Farms. Orangewood Farms has an immense amount of growth in it, and that was split up into 3, 4, maybe 5 voting precincts. So Liberty definitely to help with the growth that's going on within it by creating the Getty voting precinct, and then also helping with the Orangewood Farms growth to the north.
So thank you, Gary. So the next precinct we'll be covering is the Lutton voting precinct. And this is also a very familiar theme here in District 4 in the West Valley to accommodate voter growth and population growth. We're currently recommending that so Lutton, let me find out where this is. So this is in Surprise. It's on Bullard and Waddell, and it currently has 7,878 total voters. And by creating the new precinct of Libson, which would be on the east side of the voting precinct, Libson would then have 4,114 voters, and Lutton would have 3,783 total voters within this precinct. Anything else there, Gary?
That was a perfect description there, Scott.
Okay, so the next precinct will be the Martin precinct that we're making some recommendations, and this is just to align the precinct with the draft Justice Court precincts. And do you want to describe exactly what the changes are here, Gary?
Yes, so the draft Justice Court precincts moved about 2 miles to the east. And then so we adjusted the Martin precinct to kind of go along that. In the north end of that voting precinct, there really is no voters, it's all mountains. And so by taking in those few voters just north of I-10 into the Martin precinct, we were able to make a solid line for them to follow and move along. So the voters, it's very rural out there. And so there's just a few voters just north of I-10 that are now included in Martin on the south end, just south of I-10. So, but the main change was moving the Justice Court precinct east about 2 miles, and then extending Martin all the way up to the Wickenburg voting precinct. But the vast majority of that area is all mountains and no voters and no homes.
The next precinct is the Mesquite precinct, and this is to accommodate increases in population and voter totals. For Mesquite, we're recommending that there be actually 2 additional precincts made. One is the Sunset Hills, and the other is Posada. So Mesquite would then, which is the current precinct, be in the middle. Sunset Hills would be towards the north of that precinct, and then Posada would be towards the south. Mesquite is currently in Surprise. It's off of the Loop 303 and by Waddell Road. And Mesquite currently has 8,598 total voters. These changes would drop that down to 2,379. Sunset Hills, which is at the north portion, would have 4,902 voters, which is actually it's more filled in than the other two portions of the precinct, Mesquite and Presada. And Presada would have 1,351 total voters. So any pieces that you want or other information you want to discuss here, Gary?
That was a perfect description. You'll notice in the Mesquite, there's still kind of bumps up north of that's Waddell Road. There's a community right there. It's kind of a like horse property and that kind of thing that's not part of the subdivisions in Sunset Hills. So we felt that it would be okay to include it in the Mesquite voting precinct since Sunset Hills is pushing up against that 5,000 total voters. So that's why a lot of times we'll try to draw that line straight across, Waddell Road there, but we felt because of the one community that seemed very separate from the Sunset Hills area, that it would be okay to include it into the Mesquite voting precinct.
We do try to keep communities of interest and neighborhoods together to avoid those types of changes. So this is an example of that. So the next precinct, our exhibit that we'll be covering is Mountain Vista. And this is again to accommodate for increases in population and large amounts of voter registration totals. So Mountain Vista, it includes Lake Pleasant area right here. So here's the Lake Pleasant precinct that we covered earlier. The actual lake is within this precinct. And we're recommending that we add 2 additional precincts towards the south and our portion of the Mountain Vista precinct. Mountain Vista currently has 6,045 total voters. The changes for Mountain Vista would then take that to 2,093. And then we'd have 2 new precincts, Mayberry and Dale precinct, which are here. Dale's towards the west end of that. Mayberry is right here in the center. So Mayberry would have 3,790 voters. Dale would have 1,961. And this allows for lots of room for future or potential growth. Anything else here, Gary?
I just mentioned that the Dale was also a part of the Desert Oasis voting precinct we talked about earlier. And so that'll take pressure off Desert Oasis and Mountain Vista for those total number of voters.
And the next exhibit that we'll be covering is the Pebble Creek voting precinct. And this is actually one that we've had some public input and comments on already. And
Scott, I'm sorry to interrupt. I believe there's an Orangewood Farms one. Maybe we skipped one there.
Oh, sorry. There we are. Sorry, I skipped ahead. So, and actually, I don't have that on my spreadsheet here. So this is a precinct that is to accommodate voter growth as well. And we're recommending splitting this and creating a few new precincts. That'd be Hez, Blue Horizons, Portland precinct. Is Perryville a new one that we're recommending here, Gary, as well?
Yes, that is a new one there as well.
And I don't have those voter totals here, so maybe we can look those up while we move on to some of the other exhibits. Then we'll come back to Orangewood Farms.
Sounds good.
I'll cover the Pebble Creek precinct or exhibit. So Pebble Creek is one community out here, and it's actually experienced quite a bit of growth over the last several years. So Pebble Creek currently has 8,455. It is split down the middle by Pebble Creek Parkway and has Indian School to the north, and then McDowell to the south, and then Loop Road 3 to the west. And we're recommending that it actually create a new precinct, Mulberry Precinct, to the west portion of this, because there's still quite a bit of room for growth out in this portion of the precinct. And it's already at 8,455 total voters. What this would do would take Pebble Creek to 4,239, Mulberry to 4,260 total voters. However, given some of the input that we received from the public, we're looking to try to keep the Pebble Creek community, which is follows this Clubhouse Drive, together into one precinct. So we're doing a little bit of analysis to identify this portion down here of Mulberry, which is south of Virginia, is not part of that precinct. So we're looking if we could create a new precinct here, potentially move this into Rio Paseo so we can keep this together. So this is, we can't make a decision yet because we haven't completed that analysis, but this is one instance where we are taking that public input to try to keep this community of interest together. Anything else that you want to say here, Gary?
No, I think that's perfect. The original intention was to bring down those the total voters, from that 8,000 number, and then also to try to take major roads. And so that's why the new public read kind of looks like an hourglass, is we really didn't want to cut through the neighborhoods, and we were trying to take those major roads. But yeah, as we do some more analysis, we'll see if some additional changes can be made.
And I had mentioned in our methodology slide that another factor we do look at is the number of people that are signed up on the active early voting list, or the ones that are not signed up on the active early voting list. And currently, pretty much the entire community is voting by mail and signed up for the active early voting list. We only have, out of those 8,455 total voters in the Pebble Creek precinct, only 704 are not signed up to receive a ballot by mail. So that does factor into our decision and allows us a little bit more flexibility for this precinct. So the next precinct we'll be covering is the Pyramid Peak voting precinct. And this is in North Glendale along Happy Valley Road and just north of 55th Avenue. This is also due to increases in population growth. Pyramid Peak precinct currently has 8,945 total voters. We're recommending a new precinct here towards the south, and the Las Brias precinct, and it would take Pyramid Peak from 8,945 total voters to 3,454, and then La Brias would be 5,507 total voters. Any other changes here, Gary?
I did want to kind of mention, the Las Brisas one is over the 5,000 mark we're looking for, but sometimes it's really difficult to find good boundaries for voting precincts. And that's kind of one of these situations here, right in the middle where there's nothing, that's the mountain right there. And so, we wanted to draw alongside the mountain, or we could cut across over the mountain, but it still doesn't help us where there's really no good major roads to cut to divide that up a little bit more evenly. And so, a lot of times it's difficult to draw these boundaries and with those numbers in mind. And still, we want to make sure that voters don't get confused. We're not, cutting neighbors apart into different voting precincts. And so that this shape is a little bit out of the norm of what we would prefer. But we were really trying to get those voter totals down. And then other thing to mention is on the east side of Pyramid Peak, it kind of makes sense, like maybe we should move into Desert Sage and pick up some of those voters and reconfigure it that way. But on the east side of Pyramid Peak is a Board of Supervisor boundary line. And so that's a boundary line we really cannot move at this point in time.
Thank you, Gary. So the next precinct is the Reams voting precinct. And this is also due to increases in population. So currently Reams is, and this is in Surprise along the Loop 303 and Waddell Road. And it's currently has 7,978 total voters. And we're recommending creating the Greer Ranch precinct, which would then take the bottom portion of that Reams precinct, which would then be the north boundary of that would be Waddell. The south boundary would then be that Peoria Avenue. And then so Reams would then go to 3,709 total voters. Does accommodate for some growth there towards on the west side of the precinct. And then the Greer Ranch would be 4,281 total voters. And then that still accommodates for a little bit of growth north of Cactus Road. So anything else there, Gary?
One other thing is, there's the kind of block of emptiness just north of Cactus, which eventually will fill out. But we felt that creating a third voting precinct at this time really wasn't warranted because there was really no subdivisions planned for that area. Probably, 2, 4, maybe 6 years out, we'll probably need to split that Greer Ranch up into another voting precinct, but we didn't feel at this time that was warranted.
So the next precinct is the Cerebral precinct that we'll be focusing on. And somehow I'm missing the information for Cerebral. This is also doing are related to increases in voter growth And we're just actually expanding that out to be to the loop 303 to include those voters. Is there, and we're probably making an accommodation for an adjacent precinct. Is that right, Gary?
That is correct. We're making an accommodation for Surprise Farms to be able to lower those total voters just a touch and move them over into Cerebral voting precinct.
Okay. And then the next precinct would be for the Surprise. Now I'm missing that information as well. So we'll need to go and pull these numbers up as well. But the Surprise Farms, this is to accommodate two different issues. One is there's some homes that are the precincts cutting through, the 2018 version of it, and then also to accommodate voter growth. Do you have some of the specifics here, Gary?
Yeah, so up on the north end, we talked about that a little bit ago with the grand voting precinct and moving that line about 25 feet to the north, but not affecting any voters up there. And also, we alleviated the Surprise Farms a little bit by moving it, a portion of it into Cerebral. One other factor here, we talked about communities of interest. The Happy Trails voting precinct just adjacent there could be a sensible a voting precinct to merge with that with the piece of Surprise Farms that's north of Bell Road. But Happy Trails is a gated community, and it's a pretty close-knit community. So by merging those two pieces really just doesn't make sense at the voting precinct level. So, and trying to keep Surprise Farms from not changing drastically, we kept a good portion of it intact and was able to lower those voter totals by pushing into Cerebral and not disrupting the Happy Trails voting precinct.
We'll come back to both Surprise and Cerebral as well. And the next precinct is the Tartaseo precinct, and this is really to just align with the justice courts, and that's what we're making this change. And we're really moving the precinct from Ironwood over a couple miles to accommodate for the White Tank Justice Court precinct, and then to allow the Ironwood Justice Court to take on some of those Justice Court judicial precinct productivity credits that Judge Huberman and Judge Russell went through in their analysis.
And then I did want to mention one other thing here, Scott, for the Tartessa voting precinct. If you look in the current version of the Tartessa, which is on the left side, how it ends about halfway up compared to the new Tartessa, the boundary there's a couple voters that live up there. And so it helped to include those voters in the Tartessa voting precinct so they can come and be part of that community just to the south, rather than being in the White Tank voting precinct, which has voters very spread out. So that did help those couple voters and just keep them with that community.
Okay, thank you, Gary. So the next precinct that we'll be covering is the Tuthill voting precinct. And this is due to a few different reasons why we're making the change. One is that it's cutting through homes and also to accommodate population growth. So currently Tuthill had, and I think maybe this is one of the largest voting precincts that we had. It had 14,203 total voters in it. And we're recommending that we create actually 5 new voting precincts out of this as well. So that would be Flower voting precinct, Sells voting precinct, Verado, Tiger Mountain, and Arbor. So these are, if you can see Tuthill here, to the west portion of this is the White Tank Mountains. And then it includes, here's the Verado, and there's actually quite a bit of growth going on in this area. The Tuthill precinct that's just to the east of that, Tiger Mountains to the north, Arbor. And so what this would do for Tuthill precinct is it would take it from that 14,203 total voters to be under 5,000, 4,293. Flower would be 2,263. Then we'd have Sells precinct. And so here's Flower here, even further to the east portion of the Tuthill precinct. Sells is just to the north of that. Would have Verado precinct, which would be 3,432 total voters. Tiger Mountain, which is here to the north portion, is 1,397. And then Arbor would have 781. And these here do have lots of room for future growth for these precincts. Is there anything else here, Gary?
Did want to mention the circles on that map. You know, on the left side, there's the red circle. That's where the Tut Hill and White Tank voting precincts were cutting through some homes. So we did straighten that out in the Verado precinct on the right side, so that it was not cutting through homes.
Okay, and you can see there, zoom in a little bit. Here on that Sienna Hills Parkway, that's where the homes were being cut through. So
Yes.
we move that over to the west.
Yes.
So the next precinct or exhibit is the Vistancia precinct. So this is in North Valley along 303 and Vistancia Boulevard. And this is also to accommodate for increases in population growth. Currently, Vistancia had 7,090 total voters. And then we're recommending creating 2 new precincts here, Redstone and Mayberry. So here, Vistancia is to the, and the old boundaries is to the west portion. And then we're going to be creating Redstone, which would be then to the south, and then Mayberry to the north and the northwest portion of that. What this would do is then take Vistancia from 7,090 total voters to 4,090. It'd take Redstone would take 2,590 voters, and Mayberry would be 3,790 total voters. So anything else here, Gary?
I did want to mention the Mayberry was a combination of the previous Vistancia and the previous Mountain Vista voting precinct that we talked about a little bit ago. And actually the Vistancia, the new Vistancia also was part of that Mountain Vista as well. And so it was kind of a reformulation of the two where they came together right there.
We do have a few more to cover and then go back to cover a couple of those other precincts. So the next one is Waddell, and this is to accommodate increases in population as well. Currently Waddell, and this is Loop 303, and then along Waddell Avenue, the north portion is Peoria, the south portion of it is Camelback Road. Waddell currently has 10,849 total voters. We're recommending creating Cortesa, Windrose, and Orchid precincts as well. So this would take Waddell to 2,516 total voters, Cortesa 3,803, which would be the north portion of the current precinct of Waddell. Orchid, the portion just below Cortesa, would have 2,298 voters, and then we'd have Windrose, which is the very south portion of that, and that would be 2,255 total voters in this precinct. Anything else here, Gary?
Just to add in again, it's kind of the common theme to leave room for growth for all these voting precincts. And then also that piece of Waddell that used to be east of the 303 that was merged into the also voting precinct that we talked about right at the top of this.
So the next precinct is the West Point precinct. This is in Surprise at Bell and Dysart are the closest cross streets. And this is also to accommodate increases in population growth. West Point currently has 7,506 total voters, and we're recommending creating Banff precinct. So essentially splitting West Point down the middle of Greenway Road. And that would then allow West Point to be at 3,186 total voters. Banff would be at 4,338 total voters. So anything else here, Gary?
I think that was perfect there, Scott.
So next one is West Wing. This is also to accommodate increases in population growth. West Wing is in North Glendale along Lake Pleasant Highway, just south of the Loop 303. So West Wing currently has 9,419 total voters in it. We're recommending creating Lone Tree and East Wing. So Lone Tree would take the north portion of the precinct. East Wing would take the east portion of the precinct. And then this would allow West Wing to go from that 9,419 to 4,508. Lone Tree would be 2,660. And then East Wing would be 2,254 total voters. Anything else here, Gary?
I did want to mention, you see West Wing is spelled with 2 words, West Wing, and then the one on the East Wing is 1 word. When we look for new voting precinct names, we look for streets or landmarks within the voting precincts, and there's a street on the east side there named East Wing, all one word. And so that's why it's run together as one word there. And so of all the voting precincts that we've talked about with the new one, those new voting precincts, we try to look for landmarks and street names and sometimes schools and things like that for names for those new voting precincts.
Okay, thank you, Gary. The next one is the White Tank Precinct, and this is to accommodate the precinct cutting through homes and also to update to align with the Justice Court precincts. And then we split that with the Verado Precinct, which we had already covered, and then Miller Precinct. So the White Tank does cover a large portion of the White Tank Mountain piece. There's currently 961 total voters. This actually brings it down to 206. Verado, as we covered before, would be 3,432, and then Miller would be 463 total voters. And do you want to talk about the precinct line cutting through the homes there, Gary?
Yeah, so when we talked about Tut Hill and we made the Verado voting precinct on the right side, that's where we corrected it, so we're not cutting through homes. Additionally, the Miller voting precinct, so White Tank is quite a large voting precinct. We created the Miller voting precinct because it's rural out there, but there's quite a few homes out there. And then over on the east side of White Tank, north of what was Tut Hill and now Arbor, and over on the east side there's also a community over there. And so we thought that by them being so far apart and not really related, that they deserve their own voting precincts. So that's why we created a Miller voting precinct.
The next precinct is the Wyman Precinct. This is, skipped ahead one. Wyman Precinct is to accommodate also population growth. We're currently recommending to create a new precinct out of Wyman. So Wyman here is in Buckeye on I-10, just south of I-10 and along State Route 85 to the west there. And we're recommending creating the Dove Precinct, which is on the east portion of the Wyman Precinct. And this would take Wyman from 6,047 total voters, which does still leave some room for growth, to 1,519. And then the Dove Precinct would be 4,555 total voters.
And then the Wyman Precinct on the west side there's only 1,000 or so voters. That's still building out, and that's a new subdivision going in there. So you'll see all the streets there, but it's not completely filled in yet. And we kind of talked about that on some of those other voting precincts.
And then the last one before we go back is the Wigwam Precinct. This is in actually where Litchfield, the heart of Litchfield is. And Wigwam is to accommodate also growth in population. Wigwam currently has 8,811 total voters. We're recommending creating a new precinct, the Falcon Precinct, which is just to the west portion of the Wigwam current precinct. And that would take then Wigwam to 4,960 voters. Falcon would be 3,863 voters. And I believe this is where that the Millennium High School is out here where Falcon is. Anything else here, Gary?
I think you covered that perfectly.
Can you pull up the spreadsheet so we can go back to those two exhibits?
Yes. Give me just one moment. All right, so the first one I think was Orangewood Farms. All right, so Orangewood Farms, and there's the map there.
And this is the one we're splitting into and creating Hess, Blue Horizon, Portland, and Perryvale.
Yes, and so Orangewood Farms had 9,025 voters when we began, and then let me pull up the other spreadsheet here. In the end, Orangewood Farms has 1,850 voters, and there's a lot of room for growth there. Let me get to the other ones here. Blue Horizons would come out with 2,756 total voters. And Hess, 1,943 total voters for room for growth. And then Portland, 1,546 total voters, also room for growth there. And then Perryville. Perryville comes with, and this is on the very low end, 505 voters, but it's right on the edge of all of that growth. So we're just preparing for a lot of, there's a lot of growth going on, as we already know, and we're preparing for more growth.
And this is right between Goodyear and Buckeye, and both were in the top 10 for population growth in the entire nation. So, yeah.
And one other thing to mention, the Perryville voting precinct, and you just reminded me of on the border of Goodyear and Buckeye, the Orangewood Farms was actually in Goodyear and Buckeye. And so the Perryville voting precinct is only in Goodyear. And so that removes that split that we talked about earlier, as trying to reduce those.
And we have two more that we need to cover. That would be the Saraville and the Surprise Farms.
All right, so let me see here. So Saraville had 3,579 total voters. And let's see, with the change, it comes to 5,320. So it moves that up a little bit over our 5,000 threshold, but not drastically. And then the Surprise Farms had 7,398 total voters. So that's where we really thought the move was to really help out Surprise Farms. And let me see where we come.
And then also so Surprise Farms was cutting across Loop 303, and now it's just to the west portion of Loop 303, and then the Saraville is to the east portion of Loop 303.
Yes. And then new Surprise Farms has 5,686 total voters, and which we talked about briefly earlier is, there's that piece of Surprise Farms north of Bell Road that technically could go into Happy Trails. So Surprise Farms would then drop below the 5,000 threshold. But since Happy Trails is the gated community that's very close knit, we felt that keeping that separate was appropriate.
So we've gone through our exhibits and we're over time by 8 minutes here. I appreciate everyone staying tuned through the entire presentation. Kara, do we have any questions?
Hey, Scott, we did just have one comment from Susie asking to enlarge the text on the maps. So we just wanted to let everyone know that when they go to the website and pull these open, they can increase the size on their own device to be able to read those street names and major highways. And we have one other question that we are working to answer in the chat. That's it. Thanks, Scott.
Okay, thanks, Kara. And then Judge Uberman and Judge Russell, do you have any closing remarks?
If I could, Scott, thank you. Just a short clarification. When I was describing the net impact on workloads for the North Valley Court, I'm not sure I was as clear as I could have been. The net result for North Valley is an additional 40 plus JPCs. And the impact for the Desert Ridge Court is a plus 10 to 15 JPCs. I'm not quite sure I was as clear as I could have been there. Thank you for the chance to clarify that. And thank you for the opportunity to participate in today's presentation.
Thank you, Judge Russell. Is Judge Uberman still with us, or did she have to fall off?
She had to fall off. She had another appointment because we were running late. She needed to leave. So
okay. Well, I want to just thank everyone's participation tonight, and just remind everyone we really value any input. As we discussed with the Pebble Creek precinct, we already received some of that input, are trying to do that analysis to see if we can make some of those accommodations. So it's very important to us as we go through this process. And then another reminder that any changes that are being made to the Justice Court precincts as well as the voting precincts will be considered by the board on September 27th at a special meeting. And that's when, if the board chooses, they could approve, and then these would then go into effect on January 2nd, 2022. So with that, I thank you for your attendance, and you can go ahead and sign off now.
gonna
They still on.
answer it in the chat.
Scott, if you're still on, we did have one question come in after. If anyone would like to stay on and listen to that. Jay Brooks asked, is the total number of precincts at all tied to the number of voting locations? And if so, is the number of voting locations a factor in drawing boundaries?
So in 2020, the Board of Supervisors, to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic, went to a vote center model. And we had actually a very, very positive amount of feedback from the public, from voters, from our poll workers about that model. But that just because we're going through and doing these reprecincting now, does not mean that for sure we'll be using that vote center model in the future. The advantage of going through these adjustments in the precincts is it gives the board the flexibility to consider and use the vote center model or the precinct-based voting model. So there is a potential tie, and that's why it's important to keep those voting totals under 5,000, and that's one contributing factor. But there's not a direct correlation to the number of precincts and the number of voting locations. So any other questions, Kara, or?
That's it. Thank you, Scott.
All right, thank you.